In 1994, Sega revolutionised the video game industry with the release of Sonic Drift for the Sega Game Gear, except they didn't, because nobody played it. Being an exclusive on a system that got trounced by the competition in a region where Sonic had no foothold will do that. That and Sonic Drift isn't really revolutionary at all. But then Sonic Drift got released on a bunch of Sonic collections, and thus came the immortal line, Sonic's take on Mario Kart, as well as a million Sonic in a car jokes. And that's pretty much been Sonic Drift's legacy ever since, Sega's first attempt at taking on Nintendo's kart racing behemoth, something they'd one day succeed at thanks to Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed from Sumo Digital. But what if that wasn't supposed to be Sonic Drift's legacy? Or what if its inspiration predates Mario Kart? Why don't we take a look at what Sonic Drift truly is, and examine whether it's been somewhat unfairly misunderstood this entire time? In 1988, Sega released Yu Suzuki's Sega Y-board magnum opus into arcades, a game designed to make the scaling effects of Super Hang-On and Outrun look fairly tame in comparison. Power Drift utilised Sega's Super Scaler technology to its fullest extent. Entire 3D racecourses, with huge hills and sharp corners, produced entirely through, well, sprite scaling. To this day, Power Drift has a look that I simply adore. It's extremely impressive, especially by 1988 standards, and while often overlooked in favour of titles such as Outrun, it's one of my favourite arcade games from Sega. It's also got a ludicrously good soundtrack, with Like the Wind making it into numerous Sega rhythm games such as Project Diva, which even had a full 3D recreation of one of the game's racetracks. In Power Drift, you pick from a cast of heavily caricaturized racers and then hit the Grand Prix in a bid to be crowned champion. Each course has 5 tracks to beat, with a special 6th track unlocked should you manage pole position in all 5 previous. You've got a gear shifter and you'll need to make good use of it, as the game can get devilish with corners in the later cuts. As well as wickedly smooth sprite scaling creating an incredible sense of depth to each track, the races themselves are also fairly animated, flipping off any opponents they pass. It's hectic, chaotic, but so much fun, especially on the deluxe cabinet version. Of note, Power Drift does not have any items, or even elements like speed boosters. The main focus is just managing to stay on track, avoiding barreling off course into hazards such as signposts. You've probably already noticed where I might be going with this, maybe even from just looking at the game footage. Remember what I said, Power Drift was a 1988 release, 4 years earlier than Super Mario Kart for the Super Famicom. Essentially, Power Drift was the true creator of the kart racing video game genre, and that's particularly notable when discussing a certain Game Gear racing title. So now, with all this in mind, let's step back and look at how Sonic Drift is actually presented to us and how it plays. Rather than Mario Kart style controls, Sonic Drift is very on rails in comparison. You take the harsh corners with taps on the D-pad and brake button, rather than the much looser free reign of Mario Kart's larger tracks. You're rewarded for being careful with the brakes with an obscene amount of speed, and the scrolling effects of the track convey this speed by cleverly exploiting a hardware flaw. The Game Gear's screen has a pretty abysmal ghosting problem. In most games, such as the traditional Sonic action games on the system, this can be somewhat disorientating and it just looks bad. In Sonic Drift, the player sprites are mostly static and only have a few frames of animation in total that switch between one another relatively infrequently, even when cutting corners. As a result, the ghosting mostly manifests in the track's rapid scrolling, giving it a bit of a motion blur effect, which actually works to its favour. It makes the track appear to scroll smoother than it actually is doing, which is pretty handy, although this can't really be seen on an emulator for obvious reasons. Sonic Drift does have items, but they're extremely downplayed. Only Eggman and Amy have offensive options, and everything else is just speed boost and invincibility, or the spring jumps littered throughout each track. The emphasis is on making it around the corners with plenty of speed, but without veering off and crashing into hazards such as signposts, which may sound familiar. In fact, there's some other, more specific callbacks to Power Drift within Sonic Drift 2. When you select a character, the animation that plays kinda resembles a scaled down version of Power Drift's character selection, though obviously not quite as glamorous. And when you pass opponent racers, your character will turn back and taunt the drivers behind them, much like its arcade sibling. Even the number of tracks, while more likely down to there being 6 zones from Sonic 1 to use, matches how many tracks you'd race through with a clean sheet in Power Drift. It all points to a conclusion that's often glossed over in favour of the surface level Mario Kart comparison, that Sonic Drift was actually an attempt at porting Power Drift to the Game Gear. But why do it with Sonic? I can only speculate, but particularly in Japan, the Game Gear seems to be more often marketed as a device for children, with titles such as Panzer Dragoon Mini and the Virtua Fighter Portrait series opting to use cuter, super deformed versions of their characters. In fact, there was even an entire Game Gear brand towards the end of its life called the Kids Gear, which G-Sonic, better known to us as Sonic Blast, actually fell under. There was a port of Power Drift planned for the Mega Drive, but it fell through for one reason or another. So I'm assuming Sega decided to instead leverage Power Drift as a scaled down Game Gear title, angled towards kids by using the Sonic brand. Kids wouldn't mind the scaled back nature of Sonic Drift compared to its arcade grandfather, as the hardcore Sega fans might have had it just been Power Drift GG or something. And new elements, such as the springs and the limited items, were probably brought in to make the experience more exciting, given that despite their best efforts, they ultimately couldn't replicate the inherently thrilling, rollercoaster-like experience of the arcade. At the very least, the Game Gear approach had a single advantage over a Mega Drive version. The aforementioned ghosting motion blur allowed the scrolling to look smoother than it may have done on a regular Mega Drive game, even bearing in mind the video outputs commonly used at the time. In the end, Sonic Drift would get a sequel that made it to the West this time, and although it's commonly regarded as a major improvement over the original, I can't agree. Drift 2 felt more like they were specifically gunning for Mario Kart, when the more restricted arcade-style approach worked a lot better for the hardware. Tracks in Sonic Drift 2 are littered with obstacles that are hard to dodge and kill your speed, or ramps that have very wonky collision, as well as items being far more prevalent and extremely hard to dodge too because of the very limited draw distance on the Game Gear. Making it over the giant pits in certain levels is overly precise, and the AI rubber band like nothing else. It's true that the original Sonic Drift is a very easy game, even on the game's hard mode, but I think Sonic Drift 2 massively overcorrected things. While the increased roster of characters was nice to have, as well as the improved variety in track locations, overall I think Sonic Drift 2 missed the point of what Sonic Drift 1 was, and it suffered for it. You know, despite what I've said, it's undeniable that Mario Kart probably played a role in Sonic Drift's starting development. However, I admire Drift a lot for how it interpreted an arcade classic and managed to do a pretty good job knowing the limits of the hardware and playing to those limits, and even exploiting the hardware's inherent flaws. I'm actually somewhat sad that when the Japan-only release of 3D Power Drift on the Nintendo 3DS eShop added a Sega All-Stars mode, they didn't include Sonic as a racer. I love the characters they did pick, and don't get me wrong, I'm not the kind of Sega fan who needs Sonic to be in every crossover, that's just not me. But it would have been nice to see things come full circle with Sonic finally being playable in the arcade game that influenced Sonic Drift so much. Oh well, maybe next time.